So lately, Donald Trump has been obsessed with not being compared to Herbert Hoover. And I want to talk about why.
I never want to be the late, great Herbert Hoover.
I don't want to be a president that oversees the great worldwide depression. That was Herbert Hoover.
Rather than having your favorite president be Herbert Hoover,
I never want to be Herbert Hoover.
I don't want to be Herbert Hoover.
And I want to talk about this because for someone who seems to care very little about American history, it seems kind of crazy for him to be so obsessed and make this connection. So I decided I was going to do the research and figure out exactly what is going on here. Buckle up, Buttercup. It's time for a history lesson. So to understand why Trump is talking about Hoover in such a negative light and so consistently, we need to figure out where this trigger is coming from. What exactly is triggering this thought in Donald Trump? Now, most people who have a general sense of American history associate Hoover with the Great Depression. And that's because President Hoover was in office when everything fell apart. Now, it would be very easy for us to look at that and say, well, okay, that must be why, which in a sense is true. I seriously doubt Donald Trump has put much more thought into it than that, but that's not good enough for me. Because in reality, the connection that he's desperately trying to avoid goes much deeper than that. So let's look at some historic similarities. Now, before I get into this, I'm definitely not saying that the economic crisis we're facing today is as bad as the Great Depression. That would be very untrue. But we are facing an economic crisis. And not unlike our current economic crisis, the Great Depression was not caused by one person or one event. It was several things that all came together to ruin the global economy. But the main difference is that when Hoover was elected, the economy was booming. This would be more like Trump's first term. He inherited a booming economy. In fact, during Hoover's campaign, he said in a speech that we in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. And he suggested that if he was elected, that he would ensure that result. And well, he won. Now, this is where things get eerily similar. In March of 1929, just 2 months after he took office, Hoover signed a proclamation setting strict national origin quotas for immigration. Sound familiar? And then, just a few months later, the Great Depression began in late 1929. It all spiraled out of control just a few months after Hoover took office. And I'm no economics major, I'm just a history major, so I'm not going to get into the gritty details of the Great Depression and what caused it. But in a general sense, the stock market crashed. Stock prices had risen to extraordinary levels in the 20s, fueled in part by speculation and purchases made on credit. And when the stock market crashed in 1929, billions of dollars of wealth disappeared. The crash damaged confidence and contributed to a decline in spending and investment. Thousands of banks failed because people panicked and ran to withdraw their money. And well, the banks ran out of money. And because people felt poor and scared, they stopped buying things. And American factories had to cease operations and lay off workers. And it was all a huge mess, much bigger than the mess we have today. So jobs became scarce. And Hoover decided to support an immigration policy that was even more strict than his previous proclamation. He wanted immigration strictly enforced during the Depression. He also supported Mexican repatriation, which was a mass deportation of anyone of Mexican origin. But that is not seen as his biggest mistake. On June 17th, 1930, Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Now, this is something that Herbert Hoover is famous for. Now, the bill wasn't named after him. It was actually named after two Republican senators who sponsored the bill. Those were Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis C. Hawley. But the Tariff Act raised taxes on imported goods in a poor attempt to help local businesses. The idea was that if you tariffed foreign goods, more people would buy American, which would slow deflation and boost the economy. But that idea was wrong. Other countries did similar things in response, which crushed international trade and further tanked the global economy. And the reactive attempts at other economic policy by the administration were too little too late, because Hoover clung to those economy-crushing tariffs and never saw the economy recover. He became associated with an economic collapse that he didn't even really start. But because he made everything worse, he became the face of the Depression. And this is where Trump sits right now. The economy is getting worse every day. Now, Trump didn't create every economic problem in our country, but presidents are judged by what happens while they're in office and what they do in response. So Trump is quickly becoming the face of the problem. As president, if your policies are going to make everything worse, then you're going to shoulder the blame, period. And this is completely fair because it's the same for everyone. It was completely fair for Hoover. Trump had experience and was viewed as being good with the economy, just like Hoover. Trump cracked down on immigration and forced mass deportations, just like Hoover. Trump has imposed tariffs and started a war that has further buried the global economy, which is kind of like Hoover, except for the war part. But that still doesn't answer the question of why Donald Trump is so obsessed with Herbert Hoover. And well, that answer might be even more ironic. You see, Donald Trump was born in 1946, just after the end of World War II. The economy was booming. His dad, Fred, had gotten very wealthy from a wartime economy and economic programs of FDR, who is probably the greatest president of all time, but I digress. You see, little Donald probably would have grown up hearing about how Hoover had ruined the country before FDR brought it back. He likely grew up hearing his very successful father talk about how horrible of a president Herbert Hoover was, how he was the worst president ever, which means that little Donald is still in there, hoping not to let his daddy down. But so far, he has let America down. There is still time for him to help the economy and fix some things, but he has shown very little concern for us. He thinks affordability is a hoax created by the Democrats. He actually thinks tariffs help us. He thinks this war is good and doesn't mind raising prices to keep it going. And we deserve better. We need better. We need someone more like FDR. So I'll leave you with a question. If Donald Trump is this generation's Herbert Hoover, then who is this generation's FDR?